Hey everyone, Scott here to discuss American Gangster, starring Denzel Washington, Russell Crowe, Josh Brolin, Chiwetel Ejiofor, Cuba Gooding Jr., and Ruby Dee, directed by Ridley Scott. Now, before I get into this, I remember going to theaters not understanding what the frickin' hell happened in this movie, but scenes going on in the trailers. But let's see if I follow it this time. Let's get into it. We open with a torture scene where Frank Lucas, played by Denzel Washington, shoots a man dead. This is based on a true story starting in Harlem in the year 1968. Frank meets with Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson as he passes away from old age as he was a gangster. And Denzel always turns in a great performance, but we get a performance much later in the movie that stole the movie from Denzel and Russell Crowe. We meet a bunch of people in the Ellsworth funeral, like Nicky Barnes, played by Cuba Gooding Jr., and Tango, played by Idris Elba, as Frank will collect the money they owe Ellsworth. And we move on to Richie Roberts, played by Russell Crowe, and his partner Javier J. Rivera, played by John Ortiz, break into a criminal's house who frames someone in New Jersey as Javier walks in and calls a warrant. And there's a lot of characters introduced in the first 10 minutes of the movie. There's a shitload of characters in this 2-hour, 35-minute movie, or if you're watching the director's cut, 2 hours and 55 minutes. As long as this movie is way too long, but I'm mesmerized by the performances from each other. Richie and Javier wait for the suspect for the longest time as they do catch the criminal and count the money off, as every cop is hitting on Richie, as that's never explained why. While in Police Plaza in New York City, we get introduced to Detective Trupo, played by Josh Brolin, as his other cops follow him around as he collects drugs, narcotics, while Frank is meeting and making money. And some mob bosses, and the cinematography in like this is like in this, like every other fucking Ridley Scott movie, is tremendous in this movie, and the way it was shot was magnificent, as it sometimes jumps all over the place, and we follow Frank in one story, and then Richie on another, and then Troop on another. But eventually it'll mash up into one movie, as it takes a while. Frank talks with Tango as he tells him to get a real job working for him and opening doors for him, and this movie is well made for sure. We get a scene in the director's cut where Frank meets with the man whom I've seen in so many movies, I forget the actor's name, but while playing fetch with his doggy, and we learn about on the beach, and we learn about on the TV about the type of drugs going around back, like heroin and marijuana. And Frank calls Nate from Bangkok, and as he wants to go to the jungle, as these shots in the jungle was just fucking gorgeous. I mean, Jesus. While Richie meets with his ex-wife Lori, played by Carla Gugino, and their son Michael about moving to Las Vegas, while Lori's sister while yelling at some kids breaking some glass, which was an interesting scene while they're going through a divorce, which is an interesting story for Richie, I guess. Javier is in a rough neighborhood as he shot someone dead, and there's a mob of people outside wanting Javier dead, and Richie comes to wreck crime scene. No, not wreck. Like, comes to look at the crime scene and takes a couple of hospital workers to the dead body outside of the hospital, and they go on the way to the hospital, and Javier confesses he killed him in the neighborhood, as Richie learned Javier is a corrupt cop. And Javier jumps out of the car, and how stupid is this character? While Frank is still in China to collect some drugs and comes back to America, and this movie works better in America than in other different countries, despite the jungle scene was beautiful to watch. Richie is in a courtroom with his lawyer against his wife, and afterhand, Richie humps the shit out of his lawyer as he picks up the phone and hears Javier is dead, and meets with Norman Reedus before he was well known. And Richie signs some papers as he works out with his police captain visiting him, and he looks around a property, as this wasn't in the theatrical cut, as it doesn't work for me, as Frank calls home in North Carolina and asks his brother Huey to played by Chiwetel Ejiofor, to get the family together as Frank buys a house for his mama Lucas, played by Ruby Dee. And this is the best performance that stole the show from Denzel and Russell Crowe, in my opinion. Ruby Dee, as she was the best thing about this movie, in my opinion, as she got an Oscar nomination, and he brings the family members, Turner, Melvin, Terrence, Dexter, and Stevie. And this movie is all-star cast, is great for what little they do, except for Denzel and Russell Crowe. Well, they do great work too, don't get me wrong. Frank takes his brothers to the city and shows them what he does. At one point, they have lunch together and sees Tango at a market and asks for his money while bringing a jar with him, and shoots him dead and makes his money and leaves 20% for Tango's dead body. And it shows what a badass bad guy Denzel Washington is after this in Training Day. And he is a very good actor, in my opinion, while Richie does some investigating with his team, and Frank meets a woman from Puerto Rico named Eva and talks with Huey about how he dressed in a club like he's getting called out loud. And this scene works great for great reasons, as Frank will get to know and eventually marry Eva, and she's a great asset for Frank. Richie is stressed because they don't have the person who's selling drugs on the street, and they look around for the motherfucker and take photographs of him selling drugs, and they call a man named Scott who works at a car wash, and Richie gets 20 grand to give Scott, and Richie follows him and takes a taxi cab, and it'll eventually lead to Detective Trupo, aka the Josh Brolin character, and it connects quite well to both Richie and Trupo, as it does take a while to do so. Richie gets in trouble by the police captain as Frank picks up Eva to take her to his mama's house and introduces her to his mama and says she's beautiful, while Richie goes to a beach house after Laurie brings a person from the social services to his place. And I love the chemistry between Frank and Eva, as it works for me. The Lucas brothers do some money laundering while Frank has a party, and a party pooper harasses her people as the party is over, and after Frank beats the shit out of the pooper and kills him off, sends everybody home as he's very upset, to the point he's very pissed off. And he meets with another mobster at his mansion and tells him about the farmers, as he will consider paying their money. And I like the scenes as the song from Jackie Brown plays in the background, and they're very well shot scenes, in my opinion. Frank proposes to Eva while Richie is at the stadium to watch a fight between Muhammad Ali and George Foreman, I'm guessing, if I'm hearing it correctly, while Richie takes photographs of Frank and Eva while Trupo happens to be there, as well as I wish I saw the fight in that scene as Frank and Eva get married, as Trupo is following them while harassing him, as Frank feels threatened by Trupo, while Richie tells everyone on his team about Frank and his family members. And his schedule routine in the movie is taking its time to get into the fucking point, as a cop's work can be very hard in general. Frank hosts Thanksgiving at his mama's place while Richie eats a sandwich, and Trupo gets delivered a turkey and his car blowing up as people are getting drugged up and dying from the drugs brought by Frank. And Stevie talks with Frank about how he doesn't want to play baseball anymore, and he wants Frank's life. And Frank deals with the thing and goes to Nikki's club and to talk to Nikki about the drugs that he messed people up by calling it blue magic, and doesn't want to catch Nikki ever doing it again, while Trupo pulls over Frank and Huey and gets some drugs out of the trunk and lets him go, as I'm led to believe Huey was responsible for getting Frank caught, as Frank kills Huey, which makes me think Frank is a hypocrite, because he said he wouldn't kill his brother. Well, what the fuck is he doing to killing him in the car? As that was a bit harsh of Frank to do so, as it's pretty damn hypocritical. Richie goes to the beach house and learns about a microwave that were invented back in the day, and learns what he has to do, which is to leave Frank alone, and Richie can't do that, as he's the main suspect, while Richie is followed by someone by the court of law, as he goes back to the court with Laurie while she makes a scene before the court session begins, and he says he's not fit to be a father, as he leaves the courtroom, which was a tad bit dumb, and I don't expect dumb from director Ridley Scott, as it's Christmas time and Frank decorates the Christmas tree, and that's when the movie starts to slow way the fuck down. Frank and Eva have a conversation about going out as she turns on the TV and go to a restaurant, and she says stays in the car while Frank gets the keys from the driver as he's about to go to inside the restaurant, his butler I mean, and Frank grabs the keys and gets shot, but not dead, but on the arm, and Eva suggests leaving the country and learns Nikki got him arrested and wants him dead, and Frank refuses to leave America as Eva can't leave without Frank, while Trupo visits Richie about teaming up against Frank, and Richie says the same thing Trupo said to him, which is next time he comes to New York, call him first, as Trupo said that about his city, which is New Jersey, and while Frank calls Nate in Bangkok, and Nate says the gang's all done as he goes back to, and Jimmy hurts a woman as he gets arrested and interrogates Jimmy, and this second hour is starting to fall apart for me. Jimmy exposes Frank as Richie searches the whole airplane, even the caskets, while Detective Trupo searches the house for money and kills his doggy, which really made me sad as they hide the money at the doghouse while Richie gets in trouble with Trupo. The money from the dog house, and these scenes are kind of drag. Mama tells Frank about the family as she doesn't care what Frank does while she slaps him about lying to her, and says Eva and Mama and the whole family will leave him, and Richie and the other cops spy on trucks with Stevie Lucas involved, and they capture Stevie with a very violent action scene while Frank, Eva, and Mama go to church, and these scenes are rather brutal and intense while the movie was dragging. Frank finally gets captured by Richie while Eva and Mama go back inside as the rest of the family go to prison, and Frank goes to court with Richie while Richie interrogates Frank and go a lot and back and forth while drinking coffee and editing. And the editing in those scenes seemed a little tad bit choppy, and I don't expect that from director Ridley Scott either. Frank tells Richie and all the corrupt cops that they should arrest, as well as Trupo, while Trupo commits suicide on his garden, and they get every single motherfucker in prison, as well as Frank, and he does eventually get out of prison in the year 1991, as in the director's cut, Frank and Richie get some coffee together and become good friends, and what bothered me was the goddamn shaky camera during that scene, and we move on to credits roll to an after credits of Frank shooting at the camera, which was pointless, and the climax was satisfying, as this was a good movie, and I'll explain why in a rating. I'll give this movie a 7.1 out of 10. The shots as well as the cinematography by director Ridley Scott is magnificent, as I memorized by every single performer in the movie. But Ruby Dee stole the show from both Denzel and Russell Crowe, and it has three interesting points of view characters out of Denzel's character, as well as Russell Crowe's character, as well as Josh Brolin's character, that'll eventually be put in the same story together, as it does take a while because this is a long movie. Just give it some patience. I prefer the theatrical cut over the director's cut, as there's some scenes that shouldn't be in the movie in the director's cut. And after this, in Training Day, I believe Denzel is a badass, as he plays good villains in this and Antoine Fuqua's movie, as it gets very good gets very good acting, in my opinion, as he turns in some great work in this movie, in my opinion. The movie works well while it takes a little too long to get to the fucking point, but at the same time, it works while the second hour falls apart. This is a recommendation to see only once in your lifetime, as this is a good movie for me. So I'd like to thank you guys for joining me, and next time I will be back with Body of Lies. And until then, freeze! The gangster's on your ass.